Welcome, everybody. It's a big day for Stanford, big day for neuroscience, and an especially big day for Stanford neuroscience. This symposium promises to be incredibly exciting. We have people here who really are living at the intersection of understanding human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And I can't imagine a better kickoff speaker than Surya Ganguli. Surya is a colleague here in applied physics. He uses computational and theoretical approaches to understand how complex human perception, behavior, motor control, and decision-making arise from the dynamical interactions in biological neural networks. He teaches a new and popular course in entrepreneurship in AI. I'm sure the students are appreciating that. And I ask you all to join me in welcoming Surya Ganguli.
Thanks, Scott. You bet. Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm super excited about all the talks after my one. So I'm going to talk about neural networks in the brain from the retina to semantic cognition and beyond. So I wanted to start by weighing in on the issue that the Bill talked about, is I believe there are strong motivations for a new type of alliance between theoretical neuroscience and systems neuroscience and theoretical machine learning, which is the following, right? We're all in this game because we'd like to understand how the brain works, but it's not actually obvious what that actually even means. A more proximal version of that question is we'd like to understand how the connectivity and dynamics of a neural circuit gives rise to behavior. And of course, learning is extremely important. We'd like to understand how neural activity and synaptic learning rules conspire to self-organize useful connectivity that observes behavior. The Brain Initiative, led by Bill and Corey, has been promising us and delivered a lot of really exciting data, recording many, many neurons at once, sometimes recording both neurons and connectivity between them at the same time. But it's actually interesting to note that the field of machine learning has generated many, many learned neural networks that accomplish very interesting tasks, tasks we know of no other way of doing in any artificial system at the moment. And we know everything about them. We can do any experiment we want. We know their connectivity, we know their dynamics, we know their learning rule, we know their entire developmental experience through their exposure to training stimuli. Yet we don't have a meaningful understanding of how they learn and work. And this is a fact that actually keeps me awake at night and I think should send chills through the spine of every neuroscientist. Because what if we got all the data that we needed about the brain, how would we make sense of it? Now, I don't believe for a second that if we directly understand these artificial networks, we'll then directly understand the brain. But I think the methods that we use to arrive at an understanding of artificial networks, the important things that we decide we should measure and the things that we should ignore to understand how distributed nonlinear circuits compute, may have an impact on the way that we design experiments in neuroscience and how we focus the development of our technology and what we choose to measure and what even understanding means. We don't have to wait for the data in machine learning yet, right now. We kind of laid this out in detail in a current opinion piece. So we've actually been working just over the last few years on a host of works. I collaborate a lot with experimental neuroscientists here at Stanford and other places. But these are all works on pure theory with almost no experimental collaborators trying to understand neural networks, both biological and artificial. I can't possibly talk about all this stuff, but it's all on our website if you're interested. And today I wanted to tell you sort of three stories. Right? So the first one is I wanted to talk about learning deep neural network models of the retina, where we have exquisite experimental access and we can very sharply verify our models. And we'll show that we can learn neural network models of the retina that predict the retinal response to natural scenes and also computationally reconstruct its functional properties in the interior. It turns out the retina is actually already a neural network with one hidden layer. Then I'm going to jump up to the level of semantic cognition and ask a fundamental question. How do infants learn concepts? In fact, they learn a hierarchical differentiation of concepts through development. And this also arises in deep neural networks, it turns out. And we'd like to understand why. And here we can get mathematical insight into this question. And then I'd like to end by sort of one principle, at least that we've learned, about what makes neural network learning hard or easy. In fact, this boils down to the credit assignment problem. How do we adjust many synaptic weights to solve a problem without getting stuck? Okay. So let's get to work. So let's start with the retina. So this is joint work with the lab of Steve Backus here at Stanford, and these are the graduate students who really led the work, and there's a sequence of papers all on our website. Okay. So again, this is the structure of the retina. Light shines on the photoreceptors. It propagates through a hidden layer of bipolar cells and lateral cells, amacrine cells, and horizontal cells, ultimately going to the retinal ganglion cells. There's about 1 million retinal ganglion cells that form an optic nerve fiber and that goes to your visual cortex, and everything you know about the world is in those 1 million optic nerve fibers coming out of these ganglion cells. Now, classic models of the retina often involve relatively simple models that don't do justice to the complexity of the retina. Namely, there's a spatiotemporal filter. These are models of the ganglion cells. There's a spatiotemporal filter and a rectifying nonlinearity. Now, these stimuli do a pretty good job of predicting the retinal response to white noise, but of course the retina responded or evolved to process much more structured natural scenes. And it turns out these models don't do very well at all in predicting the retinal response to the very stimuli that sculpted the retina's evolution, namely natural scenes. Okay? So we replaced this is not a retina with another model that is also not a retina, but we included multiple layers of convolutional cells to mimic the hierarchical structure of the retina. We had about 8 cell types. We varied this, and this is a standard sort of convolutional neural network with spatial and temporal filtering, normalization, and thresholding, and we go through 2 layers. And we learn simultaneously all the retinal ganglion cells that are recorded in one retina, so we can pool information across all of these cells because the weights are shared here. Now, there's many reasons to think this could be a terrible idea. It might not work. We don't have Google's amount of data. We can only record for 1 hour. The interior structure of the model may not reflect the interior structure of the retina, and so on. But actually, those fears turned out remarkably to be unfounded. So it worked. This is, for example, an LN model. This is the retinal response to a sequence of natural scenes. This is the firing rate of a single cell. Gray is the true firing rate of the biological cell. And the yellow is the best LN model of that cell, the linear nonlinear model. And this is an example of what the convolutional neural network does. And you can see just by eye it's doing a lot better. Quantitatively, in terms of the correlation coefficient, it does a lot better. In fact, it does almost as well as intrinsic limits on the ability to predict the retinal response set by the intrinsic variability of the retina itself. The retina never fires in the same exact way to the same stimulus. So we can predict the retinal response almost as well as you can expect given intrinsic retinal variability. And GLMs, generalized linear models, and linear nonlinear models cannot do this for natural scenes, at least. Okay? So if we look inside the retina, interestingly, we can record from the cells in the interior of a retina and compare them to direct intracellular recordings of bipolar cells, which are very hard to record from. And we find that the receptive fields, these are model units in our retina, they look remarkably like the receptive fields of bipolar cells in the interior of actual biological retinas, and this can be quantified. Here's an example of the membrane potential of a bipolar cell in black. That's the ground truth. And this is, and remember, the model never had access to this trace, and the model actually still faithfully recapitulates it without ever having access to this trace, only access to the output of the retina. So this is tantamount to a functional reconstruction of the interior of the retina, and I'll actually skip this part. Okay, so now there's been a long history in probing the retina using simple artificial stimuli. For example, moving bars, moving dots, full field flashes, gratings, and so on. And this has led to decades of retinal physiology that has actually led to a whole bunch of very intriguing and striking computations that the retina does. I'll go into some of them on the next slide. But the question is, are these retinal computations elicited by such artificial stimuli at all relevant to the retinal computations that are actually engaged when the retina is operating under natural visual conditions? And it turns out, interestingly, our CNN modeling work kind of reveals that that is the case. It turns out that our CNNs trained only in natural scenes reproduce all of these phenomena, but CNNs trained on white noise actually don't. So the CNNs generalize to stimuli with very, very different statistics. In machine learning, that would be called domain adaptation or maybe transfer learning. So just to illustrate some of these things, one of them is the emitted stimulus response. If you periodically flash light onto the retina, okay, and then suddenly stop, the retina will actually keep going. It'll ring right when the next flash was supposed to come but didn't, and then it says, wait a minute, it didn't come, and then it will complain a lot, right? So it's as if the retina is predicting a periodic signal and complaining when that prediction is violated. Okay? Motion reversal. If you have a bar moving across the receptive field of a ganglion cell and it suddenly reverses motion, the cell will complain quite a lot right after the motion reversal, okay, in a way that it wouldn't had the bar kept going. Again, it's predicting future motion and signaling to the rest of the brain a violation of that prediction of future motion. And also, when you move your eyes across the world, the entire world is moving on your retina, but you don't think the world is moving in relation to you. You know your eyes are moving. The retina actually begins to solve this problem. So if you have a foreground object moving differentially with respect to the background, the cell will fire a lot, a particular type of ganglion cell will fire a lot. But if you move the background and foreground in register, it won't fire at all. So it's segregating moving objects. It's essentially filtering out predictions from eye movements. Anyway, the other phenomena are equally as striking, and the question is, can we get these phenomena? And without going into details, we actually do. We get fast contrast adaptation, latency encoding where stronger stimuli are encoded earlier, the motion reversal that I talked about, motion anticipation where the retina speeds up the image on your retina so that the shadow of an image in the outside world is not delayed as it's moving across your retina, the emitted stimulus response which I talked about, and other things like object motion sensitivity, polarity reversal, and the F2 response. So just to summarize this part, we can actually generate, using modern deep learning methods, a highly accurate model of the retinal response to natural scenes. Okay? A computational reconstruction of the functional properties of the retinal interior from the and we can computationally reconstruct the interior from measurements of inputs and outputs alone. Okay, we can actually recapitulate diverse phenomena in retinal physiology using artificial stimuli by models trained in natural scenes. So it places such stimuli on much firmer foundations. It suggests that the retinal mechanisms engaged in, say, the last 40 years of retinal physiology are indeed also engaged when the retina is viewing natural scenes. And it actually kind of demonstrates the weakness of using white noise as a systems identification technique in the retina in revealing the full diversity of retinal computations. Okay? So now let's pop up a level to semantic cognition. Okay? So this is, of course, a very different type of topic, but we'll also be using neural networks to try to understand it, and this time mathematical analysis. So there's, again, a sequence of papers, and this is joint work with Andrew Sachs, who's an integral part of this work, and also Jay McClelland, who's also an integral part of this work. And there's a sequence of papers all available on our website. So what is semantic cognition? Human semantic cognition is basically our ability to learn, recognize, comprehend, and produce inferences about properties of objects and events in the world, especially properties that are not present in the current perceptual stimulus. For example, does a cat have fur or do birds fly? To my knowledge, there is no cat or bird in this room currently, but you all know the answer to these questions. Okay, our ability to do this likely relies on our ability to form internal representations of categories in the world. We never see the same stimulus twice, so we categorize stimuli and we attach information to those categories, and they form the basis of a whole bunch of behavioral experiments in behaviors in semantic cognition, including question answering and so on. There's a whole bunch of phenomena, and Jay wrote a very beautiful, with Tim Rogers, Jay wrote a very beautiful book called Semantic Cognition. This was my Bible for a while when I first met Jay to learn about what he was doing or what he's done over so many years. I highly recommend you contribute to Jay's royalties and buy this book. I'm not paid by Jay to say that. There's a lot of phenomena which we kind of try to address mathematically. I'm only going to talk about two of them today. One is the hierarchical differentiation of concepts and categories in infant semantic development through rapid transitions. So a thing that often happens is infants around the age of 6 months, you can actually ask if they can discriminate between two categories by looking time studies. And what happens is, even if you control for perceptual similarity, infants at an early age will be able to make broad categorical distinctions, say between animals and plants, but only at a later age will they be able to make discriminations between, say, different types of animals or different types of plants, and even later, different types of birds and different types of fish and so on. So there's this hierarchical unfolding of concepts, at least at a behavioral level in infants. Okay? Another thing that we're all used to is the notion of category coherence. Some categories make more sense or are more coherent than others, i.e. the set of all things that are blue is an incoherent category, and the set of all things that are dogs seems to be a coherent category. We learn coherent categories, and we learn them faster the more coherent they are, and we don't learn incoherent categories. And so how do we do that, and what is a suitable mathematical definition of category coherence? Okay. So In simulations, Jay and colleagues trained neural networks on semantic domains, for example, a bunch of animals and birds and fish and plants, and asked the neural network to answer a whole bunch of questions about these animals and plants and birds and fish and so on. And they looked at the evolving internal representation of these objects in this hidden layer, okay, as the network was learning. And they just trained it through backpropagation. And when they analyzed the evolving internal representations of this network, they saw something quite striking. So this is a multidimensional scaling plot where each point is a neural representation of the hidden layer for each of these objects. And distance in this 2D plot preserves distances in the higher dimensional space. Okay, and what you see is that the set of animals over developmental time in the network separates first from the set of plants. Then fish and birds separate, and then trees and flowers separate, and then eventually individual objects separate. You can see the same thing by hierarchical clustering internal representations in the neural network, and you see this again, hierarchical differentiation of concepts. So when I first saw this, I was both amazed and highly disturbed. I was amazed because this recapitulated qualitatively the way infants are learning, or a phenomenon that shows up in infant learning. I was disturbed because how the heck is it that this neural network is doing that? There must be profound mathematical principles that govern why neural networks have this hierarchical differentiation of concepts. Okay? So the questions we started asking are, what are the mathematical principles underlying this hierarchical self-organization of internal representations in the network? What are the role of nonlinearities in the input-output response, the learning rule, the statistical structure of the training data? And also, we're asking, what is a mathematical definition of category occurrence, and how does it relate to the speed of category learning? And there's a whole bunch of phenomena which we wrote about that I can't really talk about today. So we did something that might seem ridiculous, okay? We analyzed the learning dynamics of a linear network with one hidden layer. The reason is partially because Jay's neural networks were initialized with small weights, so they didn't explore the nonlinear regime. But it turns out that even though linear networks have horrible expressive capacity, they turn out to be a very good model for for many aspects of the learning dynamics of their nonlinear counterparts, because the learning dynamics itself is highly nonlinear. So for example, we have a neural network like this. We feed in a training example, x mu, the mu is training example. We get out the network's response to x mu. And this is the error, the correct answer. And we minimize the squared error and look at gradient descent dynamics. If you think about the squared error as a function on synaptic weight space, there's a product of weights here and a square here, so it's a quartic function to the fourth power on synaptic weights. So when you do a derivative to compute the gradient, it becomes a cubic function. And so in the limit of low learning rates, you get a set of differential equations on the weights that are coupled, nonlinear, and cubic on the right-hand side. Don't worry, you don't need to understand this in detail. But what drives the learning dynamics, if the inputs are white, is the input-output correlation matrix of your training data. On average, how strong is this neuron correlated with this neuron, for example, across the training set? Okay? That's the statistics that drives learning. Right? So we can actually find exact analytical solutions to these equations, and they're expressed in terms of a statistical decomposition of the data set known as the singular value decomposition. I'll just go over it quickly, and you don't really need to understand this in detail. But basically, every input-output correlation matrix, for example, this is a correlation matrix of various items and their properties, can be decomposed into a bunch of feature synthesizers that synthesize the columns or feature vectors for each of these objects, and a bunch of object analyzers that project activity patterns on input space here into the hidden representations here. And the object analyzers are functions over objects that make discriminations between objects, roughly. Okay? So it turns out what a neural network does is it learns this singular value decomposition, the product of the weights, the product of these weights from layer 1 to 2 and layer 2 to 3, build up mode by mode the singular value decomposition, where each mode has a specific learning curve. Okay? And also very important, there's an associated singular value that measures the strength of statistical association between each input mode and output mode. Okay? It turns out that this neural network has very sudden developmental transitions where it suddenly learns the strongest singular mode, then later learns a weaker one and a weaker one. Okay? And this is what learning does. And we understand why these are sudden in terms of the geometry of the error landscape and so on, but I'll skip those details. But that was a little bit technical, so let me give you the take-home messages. The network learns strong statistical structure faster. That's probably a generalizable statement in deep learning. The trick is, what is the statistical structure? How do you quantify its strength? And how do you compute speed? In this simple setting, it's easy. The statistical structure is an input-output mode of the data. The strength of structure is the singular value of that mode, and the time scale of learning is 1 over the singular value. So the stronger the mode, the faster it gets learned. And the network exhibits sudden developmental transitions where it seems to do nothing for a while, and then it suddenly learns an input-output mode. Okay? And when it learns that input-output mode, it can then discriminate more objects via the learned object analyzers that it picks up. Okay? But what does all this have to do with the hierarchical differentiation of concepts that I started off with? Right? So to understand this in general, we're going to come up with a statistical model of hierarchically structured data. We're going to generate data from it and feed it to the neural network and try to understand what's going on. So we're kind of trying to unify two twin poles of modeling in cognitive science, hierarchical generative models and neural networks, okay, in a simple setting. The model that we're going to use is kind of like a hierarchical branching diffusion process that mimics the process of evolution. You have an ancestral feature that diffuses down the tree, and it has a chance of mutating on every branch until it assumes a final value across all the items. And that's like one feature, say for example, have wings. Another feature, can fly, could also diffuse down and mutate, right? So this sets up a bunch of feature vectors, and it generates a data set. And interestingly, so we know that in order to understand how this data set is learned, we have to understand the singular value decomposition or input-output modes of this hierarchically structured data set. In particular, let's focus on the object analyzers. What are they? The mode with the strongest singular value turns out to be a mode that's positive on the objects at the left branch and negative on the objects at the right branch. So the strongest mode makes the coarsest discrimination on the tree. The second pair of strongest modes make discriminations between this branch and this branch, say for example birds and fish. And another one makes a discrimination between this branch and this branch, say trees and flowers. And then the weakest modes make discriminations between the final objects. Okay? So the statistical structure of hierarchical data has this kind of structure in its second-order statistics or in its singular value decomposition. Okay? So, and we can match theory and experiment very nicely and quantitatively. So now we can put it all together. We've essentially proven a mathematical theorem that this network must exhibit progressive differentiation of hierarchical concepts on any data set generated by this class of hierarchical diffusion processes. The basic argument is network learns input-output modes in a time given by 1 over their singular value. Singular values associated with broader hierarchical distinctions are larger than those of finer distinctions, and the input-output modes correspond exactly to hierarchical distinctions in the underlying tree. Okay? So when you put it together, we can find a mathematical formula that generates a multidimensional scaling plot in the deep linear network, and we've just labeled the leaves by where they are in the tree. And you can see this progressive differentiation of animals and plants, and then birds and fish, and so on. And when you put the nonlinear network learning dynamics side by side with the linear network learning dynamics, you see a remarkable kind of correlation. But this is the difference in some sense between simulation and theory. We now obtain conceptual and analytical insight into why a mysterious process like this was indeed occurring. Okay? How much time do I have? 15, excellent. Okay, so yeah, the iPad's not working, but 15 is great. All right. So just to summarize, progressive differentiation of hierarchical structure is a general feature of learning in deep neural networks. It turns out shallow neural networks with no hidden layers, just a perceptron, doesn't exhibit this. The hidden layer is essential for this. And it turns out, this was a linear network, so it's only sensitive to second-order statistics. That was sufficient to drive this learning dynamics. Okay. Let's move on to category coherence. What is a category and what makes it coherent, right? So there was sort of a conceptual Gordian knot bedeviling the field of category learning in psychology, which is how does one learn a category? Okay? There are many solutions to this problem now, but let me explain what the Gordian knot was back in the day. Well, to identify a category, you need to know the objects that belong to the category, right? But in order to identify the objects that belong to a category, you need to know which features are important for that category. For example, in the category of fruit, it's important that they contain sugar, but their color isn't that important. So you can't really identify these objects until you know which features are important. Dually, you could try to identify the features that are important for the category, but in order to do that, you need to know which objects belong to the category. So this kind of like cyclic problem that occurs. And also we talked about this, in some categories are more coherent than others, and what makes a category coherent. So we're going to follow sort of a simple proposal that has been articulated in the past, but we'll follow it up much more mathematically. A category is a subset of objects sharing a subset of features that are important for that category. Okay, that doesn't solve the Gordian knot, but it suggests a potential qualitative definition at the moment. Okay, so let's analyze this. Okay, so we experience one object at a time, and we see several co-occurring properties associated with each object. For example, here's my son who encountered a pink unicorn, and he didn't actually like it that much, so he hasn't really encountered pink unicorns that much more often. But he will encounter many, many other objects and different features over their lifetime. So imagine, for example, this toy data set that we generated, which has about 1,000 objects, and each column is a set of features, about 1,600 features, that are either present or absent. Present means yellow, absent means blue. Okay? So now let's imagine the neural network is exposed to each of these objects, and it slowly learns and integrates its experience across these objects. Now, I'd love to have a quantitative theory of my son. I don't have that at the moment. I don't even have a qualitative theory. But we do have a quantitative theory of this thing. So let's replace my son with a 3-hidden layer linear neural network and see if it can, that would be much cheaper to raise. But, especially given Bay Area prices. But anyways, let's see if this simple thing can solve this conceptual Gordian knot. Okay, so we exposed the network to this training data, and it learned. And we can do a similar multidimensional scaling plot. And these are the internal representations of the objects in the hidden layer of this neural network. And you can see that 3 clusters emerged, and a whole bunch of objects didn't get learned, actually. They stayed kind of at the center in the origin in hidden representation space. If we now look at the synaptic weights of this network and pick out the object analyzers and feature synthesizers and reorder this data matrix using that knowledge gained from the weights of the neural network, we find that if you do this permutation inspired by the neural network, you actually see that there were kind of 3 categories hiding in this data set, where a category is defined by a subset of objects and a subset of features, such that the feature occurs in the object with high probability, and outside, otherwise, the feature occurs with low probability in any given object. Okay? So a natural question is, can we understand what are the limits of the ability of a neural network to resolve a category like this? How small can you make the category before it gets lost in the noise? Okay, so using methods from random matrix theory and nonlinear dynamics, we actually came up with a formula for this. So imagine that you have a total number of objects and a total number of features. That's like the size of this big matrix. And say K0 is the number of objects in the category, and Kf is the number of features. That's the size of this small square box. And if an object is in a category and a feature is important for the category, then the probability has this feature with a high probability P. Otherwise, out here, the probability is lower. It's Q, where Q is less than P. Then for what values of the size of the universe, the size of the category, and the 2 probabilities P and Q, can the neural network actually pick up the category in its object analyzers and feature synthesizers? And we found this very simple formula. Okay? This is roughly a measure of signal-to-noise ratio. This is the difference between P and Q divided by the standard deviation of the variables out here. And interestingly, what we find is that the product of the number of objects and features that participate in the category is what's important, in addition to the signal-to-noise. And this combination need only exceed kind of the size of the universe of possibilities by a square root factor. Okay? This is super nice, right? Because that means you can have many, many, many objects, 1,000 objects, lots of noise out there, lots of irrelevant features like the color of fruit that doesn't matter for that category. Yet, you can actually get categories that are much smaller. For example, 40 objects and 40 features in a universe of 1,000 objects and 1,600 features, for example. Okay? And it turns out that we can also mathematically show that the learning time is inversely related to this quantity. So this is actually a natural definition of category coherence that has as a corollary, more coherent categories are learned faster. Okay? We can generalize this to hierarchically structured categories, but I won't go into the details of that. You can find it in the paper. But roughly, the coherence turns out to be the similarity of descendants in an ancestral node minus the similarity to the nearest out category. So it's consistent with what people have suggested in the past, but it has a well-defined mathematical definition and an associated proof that more coherent categories get learned faster. Okay, so that summarizes that. There's a whole bunch of other phenomena like illusory correlations in learning, typicality in prototypes, basic level category effects, and other things that we also address mathematically. And you can find them in this paper on our website. Okay, now let me end with a higher level conceptual issue that may transcend both biological and artificial networks alike. Ultimately, I would love to discover principles of nonlinear distributed circuit computation that apply both to biology and artificial systems in the same way that the laws of aerodynamics cannot be violated both by birds and airplanes. Even though there might be multiple solutions to the problem of flight, birds and airplanes have shared and different solutions. Okay? So here's potentially one of them. Okay? And this boils down to the credit assignment problem. How can deep and recurrent neural networks navigate high-dimensional synaptic weight spaces to learn without getting stuck? What do I mean by that? Learning, both in biological and artificial circuits, is almost tautologically the improvement of some behavioral measure of performance over time. And both biological and artificial circuits achieve this behavioral improvement by modifying synaptic weights. Biological systems may do more than that, but at least we think that's part of what's going on. So learning is modifying synaptic weights over time so as to improve performance or reduce error. So you're trying to descend an error landscape over the space of synaptic weights. How do we navigate this high-dimensional weight landscape without getting stuck? Okay. Now, why might we think we might get stuck? If you think about an error landscape over a set of synaptic weights, this might be synaptic weight 1, synaptic weight 2. This is actually a cartoon picture of a protein folding energy landscape, and this is the protein folding funnel. But regardless, if you write down an error landscape over a low-dimensional space, you could be riddled with local minima that occur at very, very high error compared to the global minimum. So if you descend the landscape, you could easily get stuck. Okay? Why doesn't this happen for our neural networks? Well, it turns out that the intuition we derive from moving and acting within a low-dimensional world is woefully inadequate for thinking about the geometry over high-dimensional spaces. In fact, that might be one of the great ironies of the interaction between neuroscience and psychology, is that the brain operates on principles of high-dimensional geometry that the mind finds hard to understand. So in some sense, what's intuitive for the brain is highly non-intuitive for the mind. It turns out this picture doesn't really exist if you have an error landscape over millions of synaptic weights. Okay? So what I mean by that is generic random non-convex error surfaces over high-dimensional synaptic weight spaces generically don't have local minima at very, very high error. Instead, you have these saddle points, and we developed actually, using this insight, you can do something. This was actually inspired by the work on linear networks and then generalized to nonlinear. We can do something that escapes these saddle points. So what do I mean by that? Okay, this was actually an observation by physicists in Physical Review Letters by Bray and Moore. Let's say you just have a generic smooth error landscape over a million variables, for example. Okay? Let x be a critical point, a point where that function's slope vanishes over a million variables. What does it mean then for that critical point to be a local minimum? It means it must curve up in all 1 million dimensions. Absent very few assumptions about the surface, what are the chances that it would curve up in all million dimensions? The answer is exponentially small in the dimensionality unless you're already near the bottom of the landscape. Okay? You can make this quantitative. You can make a testable prediction, which is the following. For every critical point where the slope vanishes, you can plot it as a point in a two-dimensional feature space. Let E be its error level, the height at which it occurs, and let F be the fraction of negative curvature directions. So here's, for example, a critical point over 2 variables, and this is the error, where there's one positive curvature direction and one negative curvature direction. Okay? Here's everything's negative, and here everything's positive. Okay? It turns out critical points don't live arbitrarily in this two-dimensional feature space. They actually concentrate on a monotonically increasing curve. Okay? The minima tend to sit here. They occur at a low error level, and the fraction of negative curvature directions is 0. The maxima sit here, and as you move up in error, you develop more and more negative curvature directions. So halfway between the max and the min, you're dominated by saddle points. And so it's possible to escape these saddle points by winding around them, and it's possible to develop algorithms to help you escape them even faster. But you don't have to worry about getting stuck in local minima at high error. So that's probably not an impediment for both biological and artificial circuits alike. Can we test this prediction? Yes, we can. So we actually search for local minima in problems that computer scientists care about. For example, deep networks on MNIST and CIFAR-10. And we plotted the same curve, and we found this monotonically increasing concentration of critical points, which is qualitatively consistent with the statistical physics of error landscapes. And I won't go into details, but we can actually do something to escape these saddle points much faster, though it's computationally quite complex. Okay. I just want to give some poster announcements from my group. So Andrew Lampinen will talk about generalization theory of neural networks tonight. Stefan, Sam, and Jack will talk about the emergence of multiple retinal cell types. Cell types is a big deal. It's one of the pillars of the Brain Initiative. Why does the retina have so many cell types? We have an explanation why in terms of efficient coding of natural movies. And also Sarah, Chris, and Sam are going to talk about a local synaptic plasticity rule that doesn't erase, a homeostatic plasticity rule that doesn't erase information in a neural network and provably doesn't erase that information, which is quite interesting. I'll end with the references. Thanks.